The city of Paris was a center at this time of both architecture and the art of the book. There was a king named Louis IX who reigned from 1226 until 1270, and then he was canonized. He was made a saint about 15 years after his death. This is an actual book, and it doesn't really look like a page of a book, but it's on vellum or calfskin, and there's tempera and gold leaf used to paint this design, which depicts the king and his mother. This is an example of what was known as illuminated manuscripts. And these were these books that were so sumptuous in all of the gold leaf and adornments that they used that they seemed to glow. Often these books were more prized as works of art in their own right than of books of knowledge. But in Paris at this time, all sorts of books were created, from small Bible, simple books, to very elaborate manuscripts that we see, such as this one in the example. Here's another example of the book arts with the upbeat name of Moralizations from the Apocalypse. And the thing to note about this book is that it's really based on stained glass window designs. The way that they have the medallions stacked up on each other is a lot like they did with the stained glass windows. Now I find this book kind of fascinating because on one side you'll have pieces of scripture or sort of paraphrase pieces of scripture, and then alternating with that are the moralization, the morals that you need to get from that. So the scholars at the University of Paris are interpreting the Bible for the lay people and telling them what they're really supposed to be getting out of it, which is, I guess that's something that humans have done throughout their history. I still find it kind of interesting. Here's a kind of interesting example of the book arts by a monk, a Benedictine monk named Matthew Paris. And what he's done here is he's this guy was a historian, so he did a lot of writing on history, and then he would put these images sort of in the margin or associated with his writing. What's nice to see about this one is that he's starting to move into a really more naturalistic style than we've seen in a lot of the earlier work. But what's odd about this is that there's the Virgin and Child, and that's a self-portrait of the guy who did it down there at the bottom. Now we know this because he's told us that it's his self-portrait with the text on the right, and on the left he's talking about his devotion to the Virgin, and he's sort of holding the words cupped in his hands almost like an offering to the image. So that's a very literal and interesting way that an artist could show his devotion to his subject. Whoops, I'm traveling. Let's get back here. This slide has a mind of its own. So now we have some art from England, some book arts. You can see the early Celtic influences in the way that there's these gigantic letters that are so adorned that we can't really even hardly tell that they're letters. But there's a B on the left and an E on the right, and they're all full of images of apostles and saints, and there's a windmill in there which gives it its name. It's very elaborate. It's actually the first two letters of the first word of the first psalm, but I like that it just says B. Okay, it's a pretty good thing to do, just B. So as long as we're talking about England, let's look at the British cathedrals. Unlike the French, the British didn't really seem to need to go higher and higher with their cathedrals. They made these sort of stately, solid buildings, as we see in the Salisbury Cathedral here. This one has a great story. The original church built in this area was inside the Manor of the Lord, so it was really under the control of you could say, the local aristocracy, the people in power. The monk or the bishop that ran this church, he petitioned the Pope to be able to move it. And he said, because this church is on a hilltop, the wind howls so loudly they can't hear my sermon. But really we think he just wanted to get out of under the thumb of the Lord so he could have a little bit of independence. So they moved the cathedral down to the valley, and he started the town of Salisbury, which still exists today. So here's the cathedral in all of its glory, and let's take a little look at the inside. This is the interior of Salisbury Cathedral, and you can see it has a great feeling, in a way simple, stately, maybe not quite as elaborate as the French cathedrals, and also a glorious space in its own right. So now, to complete our lecture on the Gothic period, we're going to talk about sculpture. And this one is from a workshop in Cologne, Germany. It's a reliquary, which means something to hold precious objects. It's a little hard to see in the slide, but there's all these depictions of biblical scenes and saints, and what you would notice here is that they're getting a lot more lifelike. But what I notice is that it's so busy and so adorned that it's kind of hard to see. And from an art criticism standpoint, I say, how do you see what's so overstated? But that's only my opinion. But I've always got one about this art. Now here we have a really interesting sculpture, also of German origin. It's called Saint Maurice. And this guy was a commander of an Egyptian battalion, and he was martyred while defending Christianity. What's notable here is that he's an African man. He's depicted as a black man, and he's depicted very lifelike in this sculpture. That's something that we're starting to see more and more, and we see it in particular in the German sculpture. Here we have Eckhard and Uta, and these statues were created to honor the ancestors of the man who commissioned them, also German. What's really notable here is that it does appear that live models may have been used to inspire the sculpture. Also, that they're painted. They still have some of their original polychrome painting on them, and it really brings us into the early, that we'll call it the pre-Renaissance. So the stiffness that we've seen over the past 1,000 years is beginning to relax, and these images and the way that the drapery is depicted is becoming much more lifelike than we've seen for that whole period of time. So now we'll talk for a minute about the art in Italy that was created during this time. And this is a pulpit that was created in 1260 by Nicola Pisano, a great artist of the period. Now, this particular piece also has that characteristic of being so intensely decorated that it's hard to see, and it is truly a masterpiece. There's Corinthian columns there that you'll see, and in each of the little boxes at the top there's different scenes depicted. Come on, slide. There we go. Here we have the Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds. And this is one of the squares that we see in the pulpit. If you look closely, this is really very naturalistic for the time period in which it was made. And so in its own way is very revolutionary. And here's another one that's kind of hard to see, but it's the Nativity. You see the little sheep on the right, and then there's baby Jesus and Joseph and the whole scene happening right there on the pulpit. Now, in contrast to the realism and naturalism that we saw in the preceding sculptures, let's look at this crucifix that was created at about the same time in Italy. When you look at this, you can still see the Byzantine stylization, and the suffering of Christ is here depicted, maybe to evoke a sort of a sympathy at all that he had to go through. Those little boxes around the Christ figure each depict scenes from the Bible also. Now we're starting to come to the end of this time period in our lectures. And around 1300 we began to have these major changes in how figures were depicted. Here we have on the left is the Madonna by Cimabue, and on the right we have a Madonna again done by Giotto. Notice the difference, that there's perspective on the right, there's a depth of field. The angels on the left, they're all kind of stacked up on each other, but when you look on the right, there's actually one in front of the other. And if you look at the folds of the cloth, it's much like what we just saw in the sculptures from Germany. They're beginning to look like you could actually touch them as fabric instead of something abstracted and stiff. So finally, We're going to do a transition slide as we're going to move on into the pre-Renaissance. But I just love this slide. St. Francis Assisi lived from 1182 to 1226, and he's often called the prophet of the Renaissance because what he believed actually helped to influence the art and all the humanities that just burst forth in the Renaissance. So what we've looked at so far has been the Catholic Church as really a force of power, a lot of wealth, a lot of symbolic wealth, jewels, gold, all that business. Not with St. Francis. So in the Middle Ages, as we have this prevailing belief that life on earth was a struggle, life was hard during the Middle Ages and during the Gothic period, during this whole time period. There was a lot of plagues, there was a lot that humans had to endure, and they believed that nature was something to be controlled or avoided. That was the prevailing belief of the time. But then we have St. Francis, who had an entirely different view. He believed that God was expressed through nature, and that the pursuit of a simple, natural life was the best spiritual path. This humble monk became very popular, and his view changed the way that artists looked at the natural world. So they began to depict it as with a lot more naturalism, probably as a result of the teachings of St. Francis. Now, this didn't always jive with the powers that be of the Catholic Church, but that just led to some splits in the church and was probably healthy for it overall. In this painting by Giotto, St. Francis is said to have been preaching a sermon to his followers, but the squawking and the chirping of the birds made it impossible for him to be heard. So he turned to the birds and he said, "If you will just keep quiet while I finish my sermon, then you'll have your own sermon." So what we have here is St. Francis keeping his agreement with the birds, and he's preaching his sermon to his little feathered friend. So this shift in style, started by Giotto, would be dormant for about 100 years after his death. But then when we get to the Renaissance, it would burst forth again in a time of great rebirth and celebration of the human potential and the value and the lessons that we can learn from nature. What Renaissance actually means is a rebirth of the classical teachings that we saw way back in Greece. So this concludes the lecture on the Gothic period in art. Thank you for listening.